All right, well, we will get started this morning. Thank you everyone for attending on this Friday morning. I'm really excited today about this presentation. We've got a number of questions from chamber members on economics and what's happening locally as well as nationally. So I think this will be of interest to everyone this morning. My name is Scott Cook. I'm the CEO for the Longmont Chamber. And we often have a series of different educational events. We've got a number of things coming up this month. Jim is kicking it off this month with this class, but we've got classes on energy benchmarking coming up. We've got classes on social media. We've got classes on reopening and what employers are required or not required to do as far as reopening, vaccinations, and all that stuff. So we've got a number of different classes that are taking place this month. So I encourage you to check out the calendar and sign up for those as well. But for this morning, Jim Vernon with Front Range Community College is going to give us a presentation on macroeconomics. I've heard much of this talk before in some prior meetings, so I think you're going to find it interesting. And so he's going to go into a lot of different things. We're hearing on the news about stimulus. We're hearing about inflation and all these kinds of things. Well, what does it really mean, and what does it really mean for us locally here in Longmont? So Jim's going to talk about that and also answer your questions and all that kind of stuff. So Jim, I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for that nice introduction and the warm welcome, and good morning, everybody. Let me start with just a little bit. Oh, I thought this would, there we go. Sorry, let me just give you a little bit of personal background, like why am I the one talking about macroeconomics? You all know that I'm a Chamber Education Committee chair. I've been teaching at Front Range Community College, including macroeconomics, since 2009 and 2012 here in Longmont. I did earn a PhD in public policy from the Party-Ran Graduate School, which is known as kind of an economics-focused program, and I earned distinction in economics and quantitative analysis as part of that. So I guess that's kind of what qualifies me to be here. I would point out that that was all sometime before the turn of this century, and we don't want to go back and figure out when in the 1900s did that occur, and that actually does sound like a long time ago. But nevertheless, let's see what we can do, and I hope that I can provide some insights here. It's going to start at a pretty high level. What I'd like to do, my target is to spend about 5 minutes each on several key topics that most macroeconomists would look at, starting with GDP and income, moving to wealth and poverty, and unemployment in particular. Inflation and interest rates usually go together, and they relate to monetary policy, and trade balance and budget deficits also go together, and they tend to relate to fiscal policy. I figure if I target 20 minutes, I can do it in 30, and that'll still leave us with plenty of time for questions and discussion. So that's my goal. You know, I should mention one other thing. I really was a little bit surprised when Chris and Scott approached me about this, and I thought, boy, macro tends to put people to sleep. So I got to tell you a little quick story. The other night, I was just rehearsing to see if I could stay within that 20 to 30 minutes, and it was a little challenging. So my wife was timing me. I put her to sleep in less than 10 minutes, and that's not a lie. So I actually got a big laugh out of that. She felt bad, but I actually thought that is absolutely perfect, because that is a danger when we're looking at a lot of charts, and that's what we're going to look at, is a lot of charts. I'll try to punctuate them with some explanations. So starting with just what is macroeconomics, I don't want to use the word economics in the definition, so I'll say macroeconomists look at outcomes for a system, resource allocations, production, and so forth. That system is usually a country. So most of what you hear about macroeconomics is going to be the US. The probably second most popular topic is comparing the US to China and worrying about China being so big. But you can also apply it to a continent. You can apply it to a state, as we'll see. You can apply it to any country. And when we do so, though, we look at specific measures like GDP, gross domestic product, which I'll start with, wealth and poverty, unemployment, inflation, interest rates, and a few other measures. And I've got a few others. But what about just Longmont and Boulder County? As you'll see, for some of these measures, yes, we can pull those down to the local level. For some of them, it's not so easy, and it's not even necessarily relevant. So I won't evenly cover Longmont and Boulder County for each of these different areas, but hopefully we'll get through it. Okay, so gross domestic product. It's everything we produce within our borders. It's the value of everything we produce and consume. You may have heard of GNP. It's not been really widely used in probably 20, 30 years. And the reason is because GNP is a very similar measure, but the difference is GDP measures within our geographic boundaries, and GNP measures for Americans wherever they are, and American firms are everywhere. So if an American firm produces in Belgium, you're going to find that as part of GNP, and that doesn't necessarily make sense in the age of globalization. So we use GDP mostly. You would think that income is going to be the same as what we produce, and in general, that is what drives income. A country's standard of living really does depend on what it can produce. But it's a little bit difficult to match them up completely because not all income gets recorded right away when some of the income goes to capital. Income that goes to labor, very easy to, I shouldn't say easy to track, but something we track all the time. Income that goes to capital, it's capital gains most of the time, and it doesn't necessarily show up as income. So that's going to be a problem, and why I don't really talk as much about income as I do about GDP. So first things first, when we talk about GDP, we almost always look at GDP per capita or per person as the measure of true health or well-being of an economy. And what I've got here, I'm going to have to minimize your images for a second to see it all. All right, so you can see I've highlighted the US. I've also highlighted the world average and China because it always comes up. Yes, China is a growing economy and it is the second largest by total size in the world economy, but on a per person basis, remember China also has the world's largest population. And so it's actually slightly below the world average, nowhere near considered a high income country like the United States. And this is most of the G20 in this range. You might want to pause and think about, what about these countries over here that appear to be so much better off than the US in some cases? Macau and Luxembourg in particular have GDP per capita well over 100,000. These countries all share one of two factors. And if you're guessing, the two factors are, some of them are sitting on enormous amounts of petroleum, and the others are tax havens and sitting on enormous banks. Essentially, Luxembourg, Switzerland, even Macau and Singapore are tax havens. Ireland, well-known tax haven. So there's a lot of money that flows through those economies, but it doesn't necessarily benefit the people in those economies, not in the same way that you would expect true production. Okay, so that's the general context for the US. Let's also talk about how things change over time, because that also matters. This is US GDP since essentially the end of World War II, 1947. What you can see in the noticeable dips here, those are recessions. So what I'm mousing over here is the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. This is the dramatic decline last year and the dramatic increase sort of very quickly thereafter. Very different kind of recession, obviously. It's a little harder to see that the recession in the 1980s was actually the worst thing since the Great Depression until we had the Great Recession. So one thing to note is we're experiencing more volatility, at least in the last 10 years. But if I could show the Great Depression, and unfortunately the Fed just does not make that easy to find anymore, just to put it in context, we lost 50% of our industrial production in 3 years from 1929, 4 years, from 1929 to 1933. And we didn't recover that until 1939. It was a 10-year big trough. Imagine that number going down by half, essentially. And our unemployment rate was a quarter of the population, which it did not approach. It got above 10% nationally in the Great Recession, and I think it got above 10% last year, briefly. And so just for context, these recessions are bad. They are not the Great Depression. All right, we can bring this down a little bit to the state level. And here what I'm showing is the state of Colorado, but for context, New York is the highest producing and highest income state at nearly 80,000. It's actually more like 75, 77. Mississippi is the poorest state, and we'll see them show up one more time. But those are sort of the bookends. So that's the lowest GDP per capita state at around 36 or 37,000 per year. The story for Colorado looks pretty good. What I've also shown are our neighboring states and the US average. So among our neighboring states, only Wyoming has higher GDP per capita, and we are still above 60,000, so well above the US average of just below 60,000. And you can see even within our neighboring states, there's a fair amount of variation there. And I'll come back to some inequality issues later on and probably in the discussion. Within Colorado, we can also measure GDP per capita at the county level. I think this tended to surprise Scott and Chris and at least a few others. Boulder County is over here and it is strong. It's, you've seen the national average, you've seen the Colorado average. We're over 80,000 per capita in Boulder County. There are 7 counties that are higher. A few of them have sort of special circumstances, like the county that has Aspen in it, or the county that has the state government in it. Lots of things that can affect GDP per capita. But the other thing I would want to note is the variation, right? We go from well over $100,000 per capita for 2 counties down to below 25,000 for Elbert and right at 25 for Park. That's a 4-fold difference. So that's greater than the variation you're going to see between states. And I think that might be some cause for concern about our well-being as a state. Obviously, Boulder County is fortunate not to have that severely low GDP, most of which is in the southern part of the state. Okay, I'm going to switch gears now and talk about unemployment with a little bit of wealth and poverty. I'll note that unemployment is the percentage of the labor force not employed. And the reason that technical nerdy statement is necessary is because not everyone's in the labor force and people voluntarily come in and out of the labor force, which can affect the unemployment rate in ways that aren't obvious. So sometimes the unemployment rate is overstated, sometimes it's understated. Most people have sort of tended to believe that it's actually understated in recent decades because the labor force has been declining, the proportion of people who choose even to look for work. Wealth is a more straightforward definition, assets minus liabilities, but for the public sector, it's a little bit elusive. I've got some estimates. And poverty, on the other hand, is easy to find in terms of metrics, but I want to point out that it's a definition that was developed in the early 1960s. That's almost 60 years ago when the economy was very different. Not clear to me that that definition is still as relevant today as it may have been at that time. So this chart, I apologize for a little bit. It's another sort of nerdy thing because I wanted to show unemployment for 2 different years. 2010 is in blue, and that's sort of the tail end of the Great Recession. That's when unemployment was actually peaking. What you can see is a lot of variability between the counties in Colorado. The red bars are 2019, which was the last stable year we had. And you can see, again, I've got the US average, I've got the Colorado average. The interesting point is that in 2019, even though unemployment had declined nationally, Colorado had a higher rate than the US average, which was not true in the previous decade, and certainly not true during the Great Recession, when we were fairly fortunate. We were not hit nearly as badly as the so-called Rust Belt states, the highly industrialized states. Boulder County does compare somewhat favorably to both the state and the national average, but you'll notice we're nowhere near the lowest in unemployment. But again, in 2019, things were pretty stable, and we did reasonably well, if you want to call it that, with not having higher unemployment. It reached about 7 or 8% in the Great Recession. The national rate peaked at 11. So again, Boulder and the state of Colorado are pretty fortunate in that regard. I have possibly the nerdiest chart because this is a logarithmic scale. So those of you who are students, pay close attention. No, I'm just kidding. The reason for the logarithmic chart is actually that when we compare really small numbers like India to really large numbers like world wealth and the US, which is the wealthiest country in the world, it's easier to compare them, and it's also easier to see a line that's constantly sloping upward is a constant rate of growth, not a constant amount of new wealth each year, but a constant rate. And the percentage rate increase in India is in fact the largest, or pretty much comparable to China's. They are growing their wealth faster. So the green line is China, the orange line is India. But the difference between the US and China is more substantial than it looks. It's almost double. And you can tell that because you can see over on the left-hand axis, every equal distant change is not an equal unit change, it's an equal proportion change. So this small amount here is a doubling. This is pretty close to a doubling. We're about 107,000, I think. And China's, well, it's significantly over 50, but it's still close. It's not close to the US. The other thing to point out is that Japan has relatively stagnated in terms of wealth, but it's not as if Japan is a poor country. It is still one of the wealthiest and highest producing countries in the world. It's been overtaken by China in total, again, that population difference, but the GDP per capita in Japan is well above China's. And then we have Germany, which is often identified as, boy, that's another economic powerhouse. Well, that's true, but again, quite a bit smaller in total wealth. They have lower population than we do, but they're also not growing any faster than we are. Okay, now to the poverty measure, and I want to return to that fact that poverty isn't necessarily the greatest measure, the poverty rate. It's defined in the US as roughly 14 to 15,000 for a single person per year, and roughly 24 to 25,000 for a family of four. I don't know if that's the right measure, but that's what it is. The other thing you'll notice is I didn't try to compare US and global poverty, and the reason is because the poverty definition for the World Bank and others that track world poverty is so different. So with those numbers in mind, the standard of poverty for the world is $2 a day. Half of the world's population, 3.5 to 4 billion people, survive on $2 a day. And yes, that's $720 a year. You can see how it doesn't make sense to show it on the same chart, right? What does make sense to show on the chart, though, are the 50 states. Not all that surprisingly to me anyway. Mississippi has the highest poverty rate, nearly 1 in 5 Mississippians experiencing poverty. New Hampshire has the lowest poverty rate. For those of us that lived in the East Coast, New Hampshire is full of people who sold their homes in New York, and they are still sort of New Yorkers, but it's the wealthier New Yorkers, and that's not entirely true, but it is still somewhat true. Colorado, you'll notice, is among the lower poverty rate states in the country, right? Significantly below the national average, which is between 12 and 13, and we're well under 10. And now we can look at the counties. Similar story. Note that there's so much more variability within Colorado. You've got Crowley with 40% poverty. This is 2019 numbers, right? You've got Douglas at about 2, 3, right? So that's an enormous gap in terms of poverty rates. The Colorado average is here. And again, I want to just pause and say, okay, Boulder's doing okay, Boulder County, but we're not as good as the Colorado average, and we're not as strong there as our neighbors. We can get to some additional charts in the discussion. You kind of move this along. I'm under 20 still. All right, and I'm ready to turn to inflation and interest rates. So inflation is the change, which is usually an increase, in the consumer price index as a yearly rate. Interest rates I'm not going to define, and it seems straightforward, but the complexity with interest rates from a macroeconomic standpoint is that macroeconomists look at real rates, and we never actually see them. The real rate of interest is the nominal rate, which is the rate you might see on a savings account or an investment account or something that you're earning a return on. The real rate is that nominal rate minus the rate of inflation. So as an example, if you had a bank account earning 10%, congratulations, because interest rates aren't that high these days. But if you had an investment returning 10% a year, but inflation was 8% a year, the real rate of return is only 2%. The real interest rate behaves similarly. So I'll talk a little bit about that in one of these upcoming charts. First, though, the inflation rate, I think most people know in the relatively recent past in the US, we experienced very high inflation at the end of the 1970s and into 1981, it was really starting to get under control. But economists kind of measure the start of that back to 1965 because they tracked things like the growth of the money supply, which I'm not showing on a chart here. I can show one in the discussion if we want. But it was trending, certainly trending upward, and it reached between 13 and 14% as a rate for, I think it was 1979 was the peak. But it's also volatile. What you can see, though, is that, and we're going to talk a little bit about this on the next chart, we brought that rate of inflation down pretty rapidly and then have kept inflation mostly under 5, with one little exception in the early 90s, and above 0, which is still significant. We did actually have negative inflation or deflation in 2009, which was the trough of the Great Recession. That's not a coincidence, by the way. Recessions come along typically with deflation and not inflation, or at least disinflation. Okay, so that's our inflation picture. You can see a similar pattern in short-term interest rates, which are managed by the Federal Reserve. And that is certainly, I think, a concern for lots of people in Longmont and elsewhere. It doesn't exactly match, and I didn't try to match them up on the same chart. The point I really want to make is that to bring down inflation, the Fed deliberately jacked up these short-term rates. Notice that they were well above 15% briefly in 1980-81. Raising rates slows down the growth of the economy, slows spending, slows the growth of the money supply, and keeps prices under control. Unfortunately, the side effect, this is like a sick medical joke, the side effect is always a recession, and it was a very severe recession. We, in fact, kind of had two recessions, one in 80-81 and then another one in like 82-84. So it was a pretty tough couple of years, but it did bring inflation under control. And you can see that as that happened, the Fed was able to lower short-term interest rates further. The other notable part of this graph, though, is here over to the right. Again, Great Recession, 2008, 2009. The Fed kept interest rates pretty close or at zero, which is actually unprecedented. You can see even in the 60s and 50s, it didn't actually get that low. And only in 2015 and 16 did the Fed start gradually raising rates. By historical standards, even in 2019, that's not a high short-term interest rate, as you can see from the chart. And in response to the pandemic last year, the Fed did exactly the same thing. With worries of a recession, the Fed bottomed out interest rates, and it's held them pretty low. We are seeing some discussion by the Fed that they're open to raising interest rates. They're planning to raise interest rates, but they haven't done a lot to actually raise them just yet. They're sort of preparing the market with expectations that, yeah, we're not going to keep them at zero unless we absolutely have to because of recession. Okay, the other thing we can do with interest rates is it is possible to create a measure of expected inflation. If we take the 10-year rate, which is a long-term interest rate, and compare it to those short-term interest rates, are usually 3 months or even 1 month. And what you can see here most obviously on the chart is this sudden decline in expected inflation in response to the Great Recession. That's because investors know that deflation is actually the risk in a recession. It's not inflation. So they expected much lower inflation suddenly when it was clear that the economy was bottoming out. The expected inflation rate, notice how close it tends to track the 2% level, which is kind of the Fed's target. The other point that I would note is you can actually see a bottoming out, or at least a downward movement in response to the pandemic, and then an equally quick rise, which is, I think, related to some people's concerns that maybe keeping interest rates too low might run the risk of triggering more inflation. So we don't see that inflation yet, but that is a real worry. And now I'm going to introduce two measures that are Jim Vernon's alone. These are, I'm off the standard here for macroeconomics. I think all of my macroeconomics colleagues would probably disown me for this because these just are not typically discussed, but it's the only thing I can do to relate this to Longmont. And these aren't Longmont numbers yet, but you can see that property values change. And you can also see the exact same cycle in the Great Recession. Commercial real estate property price index didn't fall by half, but it came close. The commercial real estate market really bottomed out and it's recovered. And then here's the pandemic. And what happened there? Well, commercial real estate prices plummeted again, partly because of fears. But what I really want to talk about is the fact that there is a long-term upward trend in property values, which means property prices. And I think that's relevant to the cost of living. And if we can get it at a local level, I think that's a reasonable measure. So I did just that. This is a chart that I've actually used with my business statistics students. I make them sort of replicate this, and we use the Boulder County Assessor's Office data on residential real estate prices. I have a purple line in here, which is not mine. That's the Case-Shiller index. Case-Shiller is the best known real estate tracking index. And you can see since the mid 80s, these are all, index numbers, by the way, have to have a base year. So these are all adjusted to where whatever the level of prices was in 2000, that's 100. You can see the housing bubble here in the early part of the 2000s, and the housing bubble burst. And you can see that, healthy recovery in overall housing prices, but a healthy housing price also means a higher cost of living to people who haven't bought their first home, for example. What's striking about this is that particularly in the last 5 years, but certainly since 2000, Boulder in blue, Longmont in red, and the unincorporated areas of the county in green have all risen rapidly, more rapidly than that healthy recovery in US prices. So to me, that is actually a kind of a warning sign that we have a pretty high cost of living here. So I'm almost ready to kind of summarize. I've got to get to trade and budget balances first, and I know I'm running, well, I'm under 30, I'm under 25 still. So with trade and budget balances, so many people tend to think of trade deficits as bad, but I'm going to give you some pause to reflect that maybe they're not. And budget deficits, of course, are bad, except when we want a stimulus. And because Scott mentioned the stimulus at the beginning. So we need to kind of think about these a little more carefully. The dirty little secret is that trade balances and budget balances are related, maybe not causally, but maybe causally, and I'll show that in just a second. First things first, this is the trade deficit, so the balance is negative, right? These numbers are in billions of dollars, so we have a trade deficit in the just prior to the Great Recession of more than $500 billion, approaching $1 trillion. You'll also notice the lines are not the same. The current account balance and the financial account balance are supposed to be the same, and theoretically they're exactly equal, and I'll explain how in a minute. These discrepancies are literally known as statistical discrepancies. They're sort of measurement error. And yes, measurement error in macroeconomics can be hundreds of billions of dollars. And so I want to point that out in all of these charts. Don't take them as, oh, these are absolutely certain numbers, right? So if the reason for some of those differences, though, is at the heart of it is the circular flow model. And this has some local implications, but it's also going to help explain why I'm not showing much locally. If you think about a home country and the rest of the world, let's start on the outside. So the country exports, that top arrow going from the US to the rest of the world, or some country to the rest of the world. In return, we get paid for those exports. That's money flowing in. And we pay for imports, and in return, we get the goods and services. We can say the same thing for foreign investment, which generates investment income over time. So we have a timing gap. And the same thing about investment from abroad and the investment income paid. So we have all these flows, but the timing doesn't match. And it shouldn't be all that surprising that it's actually as erratic as that previous chart indicates. All right. The relationship that I'm talking about, though, is that if we look at the trade balance, there's a reality that all investment spending has to come from savings. So savings always equals investment for any system. And there's really only three choices. If we decrease the trade balance, in other words, you saw that chart bottom out, right? If we have that increasing trade deficit, only three things can be accountable. One is that we can have an increase in investment spending. And by the way, that's not bad. That's exactly one of the things that has happened with these large trade deficits is we have massive inflows of foreign capital. We have Volkswagen building factories. We have all kinds of foreign firms building factories, buying assets. Maybe not a positive thing, but we had InBev take over Budweiser, Anheuser-Busch, right? So we've got those flows, and that's not all negative, right? The increase in investment spending increases our infrastructure, which gives us greater potential for growth. On the other hand, private savings could decrease, and they have a little bit, or at least they haven't risen much, and that's also associated with trade deficits. And then finally, it's the public sector, the public savings, the budget balance. If we have large budget deficits, and I think you all know we do at the federal level have large budget deficits, it's almost inevitable that we're going to have trade deficits as well. You can't really decouple them. You can get a little bit of relief from that increased flow of investment capital in, but it's a lot of that investment capital is in fact buying government bonds, which again, not all bad, because when foreigners buy US government bonds, they're expressing a heck of a lot of confidence in our economy, even if we don't share it. Okay, one last thing on that. Whether you agree or disagree, and I'm not trying to convince anybody that trade deficits are good, but regardless, since they come along with those public sector deficits as well, we should look at the health of the balance sheet, if you will, of the public sector. And I've highlighted the US here. This is all as a percentage of GDP, where blue is assets, red is liabilities. There's a tiny black tick mark that shows net worth, and yes, It's not good news that technically the net worth of the United States government is negative. The amount of debt, as I think most people know, is greater than 100% of our GDP. That has happened a few times before, but not under these kinds of circumstances. So that is certainly cause for concern. The other thing I would point out, though, before you rush off and say, wow, I wish we were like these other countries that have these great healthy balance sheets, they also have enormous amounts of state control of enterprises and natural resources. Norway, in particular, has Norsk Hydro, which is one of the world's largest energy firms. It controls all of Norway's share of the oil in the North Sea and the hydro in Norway. In fact, Norway is sometimes described economically as Sweden with oil. It's enormously wealthier. You know, Sweden is really on here. And Russia, again, has quite a bit of state control of resources, along with many of these other countries. So again, it's a little bit of a mixed picture, but I'm not arguing that this is positive or good. It's just a reality. All right. Notice that I didn't say anything about trade balances or for Boulder or Longmont or budget balances. And the real reason is, as you can see from the circular flow and thinking through some of that, it's just too hard to track the relationships and discrepancies. Think about imports and exports. It includes imports from Nebraska and also from China. Well, those don't have the same impact, and they're kind of hard to separate a lot of that stuff. So while we can measure things at the national border, if you will, and we can measure some of the trade between states, it's not clear that the deficits mean the same things. We also need to think about the financial flows. So at the tax and spending level, what we pay in federal taxes doesn't automatically come back to Colorado in federal spending. There are always unequal flows. And just consider where your savings might be. I know that I personally have an investment account that's not in Colorado, and that's a significant part of my net worth. So when you factor in all those things, it just didn't make sense to me to try and bring that down to the Longmont level. So we can at least get to the discussion in a second, though. So I actually came in just at 30 minutes, which was about what I thought I could do when I targeted 20. I think you know the summary here, right? We have relatively high GDP and income in this area, both Colorado and Boulder County. We have relatively low unemployment, but we have a bit of a mixed picture for poverty. And in my view anyway, we have a relatively high cost of living, which I would sort of equate to local inflation. But I put that in quotes because no macroeconomist would ever really, I think, talk about local inflation. Inflation is more of a national phenomenon. And it's related because we all use the same currency. So you can't really hide from the national rate of inflation at the local level. So with that, sorry, I've been minimizing your images, but I want to kind of turn it over to everybody else for questions you might have, comments. You want more data, I can give it to you. But remember, I did put my wife to sleep in less than 10 minutes. So at least I don't think I put anybody to sleep.
I think everybody here's awake.
That's a plus for me. So what's on your minds?
I'll ask a first question, I guess. So in regards to small business in Colorado in general, GDP is different all over the place, right? Poverty levels are different all over the place. It's easy to sort of identify the disadvantages of going to a low GDP place and starting your business there. But the advantages of choosing a high GDP or low GDP location to operate your business from, are there any real advantages of kind of using that as a metric for decision of where to set up shop?
That's a great question, John. And I think you kind of nailed a big chunk of it. There are plenty of people who choose to locate businesses in lower income areas, not because they're lower income, but because property is so cheap and other costs of living and costs of doing business. Think about the cost of commercial real estate. Where is it highest? New York, San Francisco, LA, Chicago, right? Denver is expensive, but not compared to those cities, right? And so, yeah, I think the other part of the answer might be that in addition to macro, you've got to think micro. Micro is never irrelevant. Macro sets the context, but the downside is if you locate in a lower income area or lower price area, it really depends on what your operation is and what you're selling. If you're selling luxury goods, I'd locate on Park Avenue, which is where Gucci and, well, actually they're on Fifth Avenue, but still, just one block over from Park. And yeah, you're going to locate in like the most expensive areas, Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills, right? Who would want to locate a business in such an expensive area? Well, Gucci, other luxury brands. There's a Rolls-Royce dealership. I'm sure if it's not on Rodeo, it's pretty close. So there's all those trade-offs, and you do have to think micro for your industry, right? Taking it to the trade part of the equation, the other part is, as an individual, what can we really say about the trade deficit or trade surplus? Trade has winners and losers, right? The reason we have a trade deficit is, at least in part, that Americans love less expensive goods that we can import. For certain things, it's not that important that it has to be manufactured to the highest quality, which we are very good at, I should say. But it's just more important to get cheap stuff. And that is a value to consumers. It's a very real value to consumers. If we were to say, well, we put tariffs on and things like that, the downside of the tariffs has been that consumers pay more for washing machines and things like that, right? And so again, at the individual local level, it's not clear. I'm not trying to convince anybody that trade deficits are good, but it's not clear that they matter, right? To a true empirical economist, trade is just trade, and it's all a measure of benefit. Any trade that actually happens, if I pay Scott for anything, it's because what he's providing me is worth at least a penny more than what I'm paying him to me. And so there's a benefit to me. I think most of you know the idea of consumer surplus. So, I'm not pro trade deficits either, but to a true empirical economist, it's not a good or bad thing. It's just a thing. And it's a thing that matters, as you saw with the circular flow model, and it has impacts, but it's just not clear that those impacts are all good or all bad. So yeah, thanks for your question. It gets down to what's best for your business, and every business has customers to seek, but also operations. And actually, that's where I think a lot of the tough trade-offs come for many businesses. Like, I can locate in a less expensive area, but then nobody in that area can afford my product. So you got to balance some of those things.
Thank you for that answer. Good
Sure.
answer.
Thank you. Dustin? You're muted. There you go.
Thank you so much. A lot of your information has given me a much better perspective of how the actual workings of local trade, or I'd say local investment, and one of them being from state to state. I had a conversation with a friend a few weeks ago about public policy in places like um, Minnesota for future cannabis legislation. Whether or not it will pass, and the kind of investments that are actually going on right now for the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, in anticipation of, an actual legislation passing here or there, and, how much of, that area, future growth, is pushing a lot of different, investors to find, I'd say emerging areas in the cannabis industry for states that are looking to legalize. So a lot of investments, of course, local, domestic, is being outflown from, places like Colorado to, say, for instance, my friend who is looking to relocate back to Minnesota in anticipation. The price of housing has been going up there. Also to, even brick and mortar prices for businesses have also been increasing. So, a lot of this has given me like I said, a great perspective of, where money flows in and out of, the country, but also where it flows in our states domestically.
Yeah.
So, I just have a much, better working knowledge now, knowing that, hey, this is how it works. So, thank you.
Glad to hear that. Thank you. Cannabis is one of those, it's technically a microeconomics issue, but states and local governments often look at a specific microeconomic market as a very important macroeconomic driver. So I think, in Longmont, we have we have breweries, we have tech firms, we have the food and beverage industry. We have some significant players, right? And that clearly is something that is kind of a core competency in this area. So microeconomic issues, and I don't know to the extent which cannabis might be affecting Boulder relative to the rest of Colorado, it might very well. And so you could consider that a driver. I know I've heard from a lot of realtors over the past, I don't remember exactly when we legalized, but certainly over that period and before that, they noticed a lot of folks from California and other states thinking about moving to and actually buying property in Colorado. I don't know that you can tie that directly to cannabis, but certainly there's some anecdotal evidence about that. Getting back to that commercial real estate piece though, and residential real estate, yeah, that's always going to be a very micro decision, because I mean, just think about a home. Every home is so unique, right? Prices fluctuate, but you can predict price per square foot and things like that. And you can see trends. So you know where prices are increasing more rapidly and increasing less rapidly. And that's going to influence, people's decisions. To some extent, small business might track residential real estate as well as it tracks commercial real estate, because small businesses don't build big factories. They don't build big complexes. They don't big retail. They build small retail. And it's a little more like the residential trends, I would think. But I think they both matter. And again, it's going to be very unique to each situation as to, where would you want to locate. Certainly with cannabis, you'd probably want to be tracking that nationally, because you'd probably look at every state legislature, at least looking at it. And some are saying no way. And so you kind of write those off for the next 5-10 years at least. But the trend is certainly towards more states legalizing. And the other thing I would point out is that in Minnesota, I'm sure you'd find the same kind of variation. I don't know if you'd find the same range of volatility among the counties or other localities that you could measure, but I would be willing to bet that Minneapolis-St. Paul is one of the highest income and also one of the highest cost areas of the state. They do tend to go together, right? So every time you look at, this is great, we're so much better off because we have a higher GDP per capita. That's real, but we pay more for property. So what that actually leads me back to, though, is a concern about inequality and the fact that if you already own your home, you're benefiting from those increasing prices, although I consider that benefit to be meaningless in my own home, because my own home has gone up in value, but anything else I could buy has gone up just as much. So it just doesn't benefit me directly. It may be nice to think about, but it's also potentially dangerous to get complacent, because think about that graph and how the bubble burst in 2005. I'm not saying we're in a bubble. I don't have enough real estate market expertise, but we've seen it happen. And we've seen a lot of catastrophic results when it did. So thank you for your comment.
Yeah, Jim, kind of going off of Faustine's question. First of all, thank you for putting this together. You put a lot of effort into this and, helping us understand, how the macro impacts the micro for our businesses. I think that was very helpful. I got a question on inflation.
Yeah.
So year over year, our inflation is at 2.6% as measured by the CPI. It's an increase of 0.5 percentage point prior to the last 12 months. So it was at 2.1, now it's at 2.6.
That's right.
I think it's important to be mindful of, like, our dollar is losing value, obviously, rapidly, actually, locally. And so, but as a small business owner, like, having cash reserve, like, sustained my business. Like, I wouldn't have a business today if it wasn't for having cash, right? I've overcome a lot by having that reserve. So I'm constantly assessing how much is too much when it comes to sitting on cash, right? And so you mentioned earlier in the presentation around the Feds really taking a hard look at increasing the interest rates. We're not going to stay at close to zero forever. Right. And so what's your thoughts on how will the inflation rate be impacted when eventually the Feds increase those rates?
Well, that's if and when the Fed increases rates, that's going to be why. It's going to be worried about inflation, and it's going to want to signal to to investors in the business community that it's serious about keeping inflation in check. In the past year, it's needed to show that it's serious about keeping the economy alive. So it bottomed out rates, which I think, people argue about it all the time, but when you think about that just massive drop in GDP and the risk of deflation, not too many people argue that we should have had high interest rates last year. Everybody, though, people notice a small 0.5% increase in the inflation rate, even though 0.5%, if you look over the past 10, 20 years, not unusual to fluctuate even a percent or two. But any movement up gets people thinking, okay, wait a minute, what are we doing with rates, and are we being sensible? So I got to believe that's the hardest thing for the Fed to judge and manage, is what's the right amount and when should it do it. The one thing you can, I think, mostly count on the Fed for is that in terms of raising interest rates, it's not likely to meet next month and just jack them way up. Each month it sort of tries to send some signals, and what it's really trying to do is say, hey, we want stability. We're not trying to jack things around. So you can't go lower than 0. So there's no room there, right? But in terms of moving it up, their history of the last 20, 30 years has been maybe a 1/4 point, maybe a 1/2 point. I'm not sure they've ever made a single decision. They meet every 6 weeks, and they decide whether to keep interest rates, whether to keep the target rate the same, raise it or lower it. I don't think they've ever done more than a 1/2 point in one direction in that entire 25 years. I could be wrong about that, but it's very uncommon. And so, and I don't time the Fed's meetings. I don't sort of have calendars. Oh, they're meeting on the 15th. I really don't know when the next Fed meeting is. I know that's sort of loses all credibility as a macroeconomist, but I would guess that in the next meeting, they might raise them by a small amount because people are expressing concerns and because the actual rate showed a 0.5% annualized increase. So yeah, the Fed is, I think, going to take that seriously. At the same time, the recovery is really fragile, right? I mean, we're clearly not quite out of the woods yet. We're getting there. We've had 3 waves already, 3 or 4. I lose track. I've actually even sort of burned out on watching the pandemic charts, right? I know that trends are mostly favorable, but you see the occasional spike in cases or hospitalizations or what have you. We've seen that turn around a couple of times. That's my worry, that I wouldn't want to just start celebrating and say, hey, the pandemic's over, everything's normal, we're going to keep growing. There are a lot of ifs there. I do think that's certainly possible. I'm hopeful that it's going to happen. I'm glad I'm not the Fed and having to sort of know, because when they make a decision, it's for the next 6 weeks. And 6 weeks is actually both a very short period of time, if you look at those charts that I showed, but also could be a very long period of time if some kind of catastrophe were to strike, that can cause a very real, sudden downturn, as we saw last year. So, yeah, in terms of your earlier point and question about the cash balances and the cash reserves in your business, I guess that's at the micro level, that's the same problem that the Fed has. Like, I don't know what the right answer is. I don't know if, keeping some of that in gold, for example, would be sensible. You can get a gold account. The one thing that's true of gold investments is that they are really not much different from cash. Any decent brokerage type firm can put your money in a money market fund or a gold fund, and you can switch them in a 2-minute transaction or 30-second transaction for the most part. So, but at the same time, I'm not recommending gold. It's just that gold tends to be the thing that people with inflation fears flock to. In periods of high inflation, you can see that the value of gold doesn't drop the way the value of the dollar does. And is that useful to your business? I don't really know. Possibly, but kind of up to you.
Thanks, Jim.
Sure.
Jim, you said that at the beginning of the presentation, manufacturing, I'm not quite sure how you worded it, but was loosely attached to GDP, or the amount of goods produced, I should
Goods
say.
produced, goods and
I'm adding
services.
the word
Sorry, goods and services. Did you notice that Scott took notes, by the way? I was very impressed.
And actually, you may have just answered my question because you did say goods and services.
It is goods and
I was
services.
thinking manufacturing. So I was going to ask you about, a service-based economy and what
Right.
that did to GDP. And then
Sure.
the second part to that question was, how does that compare when you have a more service-based economy like the US has traditionally been, although there's been a resurgence of manufacturing,
Yeah.
versus an economy like China, which is heavily dependent on,
Yeah.
on manufacturing and
Great
actual
question.
goods produced.
Great and complex question, which I can basically say I can't answer, but I'll try anyway. First of all, yeah, we have increasingly in the US since World War II really have shifted the balance. The percentage of the economy that's manufacturing versus services has declined. But I want to point out, we are still the world's largest manufacturer. We manufacture so many goods and services. We're just really good at it, and we've automated a lot of it. So a lot of employment has gone out of manufacturing because it's not manual anymore. And Front Range is literally a part of that. Our Center for Integrated Manufacturing is teaching students computer numerically controlled machining, not manual lathe and manual mill. We start there, but what we train them on is to run the big Swiss machine that can pop out thousands and thousands of parts in a couple of hours, which you can't do. And so it's sort of a double-edged sword that we get these tremendous efficiencies in manufacturing. And I think we are the envy of the world in terms of high-tech manufacturing. But where labor costs are involved, we tend to outsource those things when things are high labor. And China has taken advantage of that differential in wage rates. But the other truth is that China itself has been outsourcing now for a number of years because the wage rates in China are much higher than they are in Vietnam or some of the neighboring countries. And that makes a very real difference when you're talking about very labor intensive things. To an economist, GDP is GDP, and it shouldn't really matter whether it's a service or a physical item. What we do see, though, is I think in trade, it's a little bit harder to establish exports of services. We're doing it, but to export your services, you actually have to locate overseas. China doesn't have to locate its factories anywhere but China. Of course, it is actually losing some factories to Vietnam and other lower wage countries. That's just a general trend that's always going to be true. And so, getting back to the kind of the balance, I'm not particularly, it's kind of like my view on trade. I don't know that I have a position on whether it's good or bad that we have more services than manufacturing. For an area like Longmont, I think it's important to note that we have both, but we do have manufacturing. Beer is manufacturing. It's my favorite manufacturing, right? It's not always thought of as the most common manufactured good, but it, I think, could be one of the most common manufactured goods in my refrigerator. So, and we have plenty of other, again, manufacturing, light manufacturing, and tech in Longmont as well. Longmont in the Boulder County area. So,
Right.
So thank you. Yeah.
And speaking of that too, and in the tech area, and probably even in the beer area, but innovation, it seems like not only are we the largest manufacturing country, but probably still one of the most innovative.
Yes.
And how does that, or any comment on that, on how that weighs into
I'm so glad you asked.
GDP
Yes.
and all that bigger?
I didn't have any charts on it, but to a macroeconomist, technology is one of the most important drivers of growth. And by technology, I don't want to narrow it. Most people think, oh, computers. No, beer is technology, brewing technology. Actually, I've been looking a lot lately at momentum optics here in Longmont. And that's a great example of innovation in the optics technology fabrication area, right? And so it has both a local impact, but it has a local impact for the same reason that it has a macroeconomic impact. As we develop better, faster, cheaper ways of doing things, we do benefit. Now, sometimes we benefit because we ship, we outsource to cheaper labor overseas, and those who are working in those industries, there are always winners and losers. So we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that, yes, some people had steady jobs in manufacturing that don't exist anymore. I'm not making light of that. And by the way, that's probably one of the things I think macroeconomics and economists in general just don't have a whole lot of say. The only answer is education, which sounds great in theory, but it's much more tough to achieve in practice. Can you get the retraining to give you the same level of income? That's really tough. But that innovation is a very clear advantage. And I think one of the reasons why the US remains the wealthiest country, one of the highest income countries. And I don't want to dismiss all the countries that have higher GDP per capita. Oil is real. So if you're sitting on a lot of petroleum, yes, you can have a very high income economy. We have a much more diversified economy. We actually are one of the top producers of oil in the world. People forget that sometimes, but we're also a top manufacturer, tops in engineering and other service type industries. You know, we have great tourism. We have the most diversified economy that I can think of at the high end. In fact, if you look at some of the European countries have probably the most comparable standard of living to the US. A few of the European countries, not just Norway, but a few have higher GDP per capita. Okay, but if you look at any one country, Switzerland, for example, has very high income. It's a tax haven, but it also means that economy is not quite as diversified. I think of Switzerland as banking, chocolates, and cheese. And that's a misnomer because they've also got great tourism, but they don't have our manufacturing base. They have some. And the same thing is true of Belgium and other individual countries. It's also, though, probably smarter to think of Europe as the country. It's a trade union, and we are a trade union as well. I mean, that's how the United States was fashioned after the Articles of Confederation. We realized we needed a trade union, and that's one of the things the Constitution brought us. So, you know, I would still say technology and the importance of education is both at the individual level, but also at the systemic level. If you look at things like basic literacy rates, countries that have high literacy rates are generally higher income because their workers are more easily trainable to do different industries and to do different services and so forth. And so, you know, it's hard to separate technology and innovation from education. They are separate factors, but that technology driver is one of the keys for long-term growth. And yeah, I agree. We both locally, I think we rock it, and as a country, I think we rock it. I worry a little bit about intellectual property and how we can leverage our technology expertise without it dissipating worldwide. I would come back to the fact that maybe not all technology, though, leads to mass production of goods. When it leads to mass production of something, then those mass production jobs often are overseas. So chip manufacturing, mostly overseas, right? I've noticed, though, that the really specialized high value chips are still Silicon Valley, still US, not as many, but you know, we really do some of the really great stuff here. And it's the commodity chips, though, that drive the bulk of the market. And yeah, those are.
Hey, Jim,
yeah.
we are at the 10:30 mark, but
Yeah,
I did notice that Faustine had his hand up. I don't know if we
I'm sorry.
get it one more
Faustine, go
question
ahead.
in.
Sorry, I don't want to hold you longer, but
Not at all.
up until like last year, December, I would listen to Colorado Public Radio with Kyle Risdale, Market Watch daily, and he would have a lot of insight of our different, you know, Fed region areas and how, you know, we have or they have actual people on the ground finding out different price index by, you know, buying, I guess, bread and milk and so on throughout the country, and also reviewing and surveying a lot of local businesses and so on. How much of that information goes into, you know, a lot of their policy? You know,
Into our policies?
Yeah, in a lot of their policies, that the actual, you know, going in, touching and feeling, working with local businesses, you know, reporting on how much, you know, bread prices and, you know, such stuff like milk and such actually, you know, cost within different regions and such.
Yeah, we actually, we don't report them, but we do have regional measures of the cost of living as well. They're not really reported as inflation measures, but yeah, you do see regional variation in prices, partly because of proximity. It still matters a little bit. Transportation, though, has become so much more efficient over the past, I don't know, 50 to 100 years, but even in the last 20, that the shipping differences don't seem to matter as much. So even if you're not close to the source, for example, for instance, even compared to my childhood, the availability of fresh fruit, it's year round. It's year round because it's not so much more expensive to transport from South America, for example, or more equatorial regions. So I don't know that it's quite as much of a difference. I still think it's relevant for sure. I guess I'm beginning to think though that things like the property values are the bigger driver of those differences in localities, because that's much more fixed, and location really does matter. In fact, location is sort of everything in terms of real estate prices, right? And so for Boulder, for example, where are they going to build? Right? It's pretty built up, right? And there are also zoning restrictions. So hard to see how you're going to have a massive increase in the supply of housing in Boulder, which tells me that if I own property in Boulder, I guess I should feel pretty good about that. I don't. I own property in Loveland though, and Loveland has a few open areas, but Loveland's getting crowded too. So I just think at the local level, for me, this is just an opinion. Call it an informed opinion, but certainly not a hard and fast macroeconomics conclusion. But I would pay more attention to the prices of some of those big dollar items like houses than I would for bread and food. The other thing about bread and food in general is it's also much more volatile. And if you're not aware, most of the reported measures of inflation leave out oil and food, which are huge expenses. And it's a little bit frustrating sometimes to see that, because in the long term, it clearly does matter. But you don't want an inflation measure that's bouncing around all the time. If you think about what happens to gasoline prices, but also bread and a few other things, that's why those measures are left out of the usual measures that are reported. It doesn't mean we don't track them, we do. But they're so volatile that, the other reason you want the measure of inflation is not just to, hey, did prices increase last month? You really want to know, hey, have they increased over the past year, over the past 5 years? That's the long-term erosion of the value of the dollar, right? In the short run, it's really more of a microeconomics question. But I won't deny that it still has a macroeconomic impact. I hate to give that kind of answer, but it kind of has to be ambiguous because of the way it impacts individuals differently. So, all right. We are probably out of time, aren't we? I'm happy to stay, by the way, but I want to be respectful of everybody else's time too, and I probably don't want the recording to go forever either. We could take a pool on how many people are going to fall asleep to the recording.
Well, I found it really interesting.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you
I
very
really
much,
was
Jim.
nervous about this. I really was, because I do love this stuff. It's why I teach it, right? It's why I studied it. But I know that there's a lot of glassy-eyed reactions to these kinds of charts, right? Because and macro, even more than micro, is so chart-driven, right? My biggest work on this was actually to cut out a bunch of charts, which to me are of course fascinating, but they're going to look the same to most people. Here's another line that goes up and down. So, thank you all. I appreciate you coming. Happy to follow up with you later if you have any questions. Chris and Scott both have my contact information. So have a great day.
Yep. Thank you again, Jim.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Got my business
Thank
stats
you.
class now. Take care, everybody. I should stop and then stop the recording, right? Stop. Yes.
There you go.